The plane carried 92 passengers on a routine morning flight. Everything was normal until the pilot stopped talking. Complete radio silence. No intercom response. No acknowledgement. The flight attendants desperately tried reaching them, but the cockpit remained locked and silent. That's when a quiet passenger revealed she wasn't who everyone thought she was. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 777 cut through the morning sky at 37,000 feet, its twin engines producing the steady roar that passengers barely noticed after the first few minutes of flight. Flight 447 from Denver to Miami carried exactly 92 passengers on this Thursday morning in late March, a comfortable load that left the middle seats mostly empty and gave travelers room to spread out during the 3-hour journey across the American heartland. Outside the oval windows, brilliant sunshine reflected off an endless white carpet of clouds stretching to every horizon, creating the peaceful vista that makes flying seem almost magical when weather cooperates and turbulence stays away. Inside the spacious cabin, passengers had settled into the comfortable routines that define modern air travel for millions of people every single day. Businessman Michael Torres sat in first class reviewing quarterly reports on his laptop, occasionally sipping expensive whiskey while mentally preparing for an important client presentation in Miami that could determine whether his consulting firm landed a 7-figure contract. 3 rows behind him, retired teacher Margaret Chin dozed peacefully with a paperback novel open on her lap, dreaming of the beach vacation awaiting her in Fort Lauderdale, where her daughter's family had rented a waterfront condo for spring break. In the economy section, college student Jake Morrison listened to music through wireless earbuds while scrolling mindlessly through social media posts from friends already partying in Miami for spring break, his anticipation building with every mile that brought him closer to a week of irresponsible freedom. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with the practiced efficiency that comes from serving drinks and snacks on thousands of identical flights. Head flight attendant Jessica Chen, a 12-year veteran who had worked every aircraft type in the airline's fleet, pushed the beverage cart down the narrow aisle while maintaining the pleasant professional smile that passengers expected but rarely acknowledged. Her colleague Maria Santos followed behind, collecting empty cups and trash, both women executing the choreographed dance of cabin service that they could perform in their sleep after years of repetition on flights crisscrossing the continent daily. In seat 14C, sandwiched between a sleeping businessman and a teenage girl absorbed in her phone, sat a woman who appeared completely unremarkable in every possible way. Elena Reyes wore faded blue jeans and a plain gray cotton sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail secured with an ordinary elastic band. No jewelry decorated her fingers or neck, no makeup enhanced her natural features, and no designer labels marked her clothing as anything special or expensive. She looked like 1,000 other middle-aged women traveling for business or visiting family, the kind of passenger that flight attendants glanced at briefly while taking drink orders before immediately forgetting everything about her appearance or presence. When Jessica reached row 14 with the beverage cart, she offered Elena the standard greeting without really looking at her face. "Good morning, would you like something to drink?" "Coffee, please, black," Elena replied quietly, her voice carrying no accent or distinctive quality that would make it memorable. Jessica poured the coffee from an industrial-sized pot into a small plastic cup, handed it across the businessman still snoring against the window, and moved on to the next row without another word or thought about the woman in seat 14C who had just received her morning caffeine. What Jessica could not possibly know, what nobody aboard Flight 447 had any reason to suspect, was that Elena Reyes possessed aviation credentials and flying experience that exceeded those of the 2 pilots currently controlling the aircraft from the locked cockpit 70 feet ahead. The woman sipping black coffee in the cramped middle seat had spent 18 years as a commercial airline captain flying domestic and international routes for 2 major carriers, accumulating over 12,000 flight hours in aircraft ranging from regional jets to wide-body Boeing 777s identical to the one currently cruising toward Miami. She had flown through hurricanes off the Gulf Coast, navigated equipment failures over the Atlantic Ocean, and executed emergency landings when engines failed or hydraulic systems malfunctioned during critical phases of flight. But Elena's aviation resume extended far beyond commercial airline flying. After her airline career, she had been recruited by a major aircraft manufacturer to join their elite test pilot program, one of only 3 women selected that year from a competitive pool of hundreds of qualified applicants. For 5 years she had flown experimental aircraft through intentional failures and extreme scenarios that would never be attempted with paying passengers aboard, deliberately pushing machines and herself to the absolute limits of capability and endurance. She had stalled prototype jets at maximum altitude to test recovery procedures, shut down engines during takeoff to verify abort capabilities, and flown damaged aircraft with compromised control surfaces to determine minimum controllability parameters that engineers would use to certify new designs as safe for commercial operation. Elena had experienced rapid decompression events in pressure chambers, survived simulator sessions where every possible system failed simultaneously, and trained extensively in emergency procedures that most commercial pilots would never encounter during entire careers spanning decades. She had landed aircraft with no hydraulics using only engine thrust for control, recovered from unusual attitudes that would have killed less skilled pilots, and walked away from test flights where something went catastrophically wrong, but her skill and training kept everyone alive despite mechanical failures that should have been fatal. 2 years ago, everything changed during a routine test flight that became a nightmare. Elena had been evaluating a new flight control system when a software error caused the aircraft to enter an unrecoverable spin at 18,000 feet. She managed to eject safely, but 2 colleagues in the back seat died when their ejection seats malfunctioned, leaving Elena as the sole survivor of an accident that destroyed a $50 million prototype and haunted her every night with memories of friends screaming over the intercom during the final seconds before impact. The investigation cleared her of any fault, praising her quick decision to eject when recovery became impossible, but Elena could not forgive herself for surviving when her colleagues did not. She quit flying immediately, sold her personal aircraft, donated her flight gear to aviation schools, and built a new career as a software consultant specializing in database architecture for healthcare systems. She moved to a small apartment in Denver, deliberately choosing a location far from any airport where the constant sound of aircraft overhead would not remind her daily of the career she had abandoned. She avoided aviation news, unfollowed pilot friends on social media, and constructed a careful life completely separate from the cockpits where she had spent most of her adult existence. This morning's flight to Miami represented only the 4th time Elena had flown as a passenger since leaving aviation. She was traveling for a client presentation about database security protocols, a perfectly mundane business trip that should involve nothing more complicated than laptop work and bad airport coffee. When she booked the ticket, she deliberately chose a middle seat in economy class despite having enough status from her airline career to upgrade to first class, preferring the anonymity and discomfort that discouraged conversation with seatmates who might ask about her profession or background. Elena sipped her coffee slowly, staring out the window past the sleeping businessman at the endless blue sky that had once felt like home but now seemed like a beautiful prison holding memories she desperately wanted to forget. She felt the subtle movements of the aircraft responding to autopilot corrections, noticed the slight turbulence pattern suggesting wind shear in the jet stream, and registered the professional efficiency of the flight attendants managing cabin service. Despite 2 years away from cockpits, her pilot awareness remained sharp and automatic, constantly processing details that other passengers never noticed or considered. In the locked cockpit 70 feet ahead of where Elena sat sipping coffee, Captain James Morrison occupied the left seat reviewing weather reports for their arrival in Miami. At 53 years old with 28 years of airline experience, Morrison was the kind of steady professional pilot that airlines valued for consistent performance and unflappable demeanor during challenging situations. He had over 19,000 flight hours spanning 4 decades of flying everything from small trainers to massive international widebodies, and his personnel file contained nothing but positive evaluations and commendations from Czech pilots who regularly assessed his skills and decision-making. Sitting in the right seat, First Officer David Peterson handled routine radio communications with air traffic control while monitoring aircraft systems on the flight management computer. At 36 years old, Peterson had 11 years with the airline and 6,000 flight hours, still young enough to feel excitement about flying but experienced enough to handle most situations with confident competence. Both men executed their duties with the professional precision that keeps commercial aviation remarkably safe, their confidence built on thousands of hours and millions of miles flown without serious incident or accident. The cockpit environment was comfortable and modern, with advanced avionics displays presenting every critical parameter in easy-to-read formats that reduced pilot workload during normal operations. The autopilot maintained perfect altitude and heading, the engines hummed with healthy reliability, and weather radar showed only scattered fair weather clouds ahead with no convective activity requiring deviation or caution. Everything about Flight 447 was proceeding exactly as planned, a routine morning flight that would deliver 92 passengers safely to Miami without drama or difficulty. At 10:47 in the morning, exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes after departing Denver, Air Traffic Control in Jacksonville Center transmitted a routine position report request. The controller, a 20-year veteran named Patricia Williams, expected an immediate acknowledgement confirming the aircraft's altitude and heading, a simple radio call that pilots make dozens of times during every flight without conscious thought or effort. Delta 447 Heavy, Jacksonville Center, position report please, confirm altitude and heading. Silence answered. Not static, not garbled transmission, but complete radio silence suggesting the aircraft was no longer monitoring the assigned frequency or responding to calls. Patricia frowned slightly at her radar screen, watching Flight 447's transponder paint a steady return showing the Boeing 777 maintaining course and altitude with no indication of any problem or emergency. She assumed perhaps the pilots had momentarily switched to another frequency or were distracted by some minor issue requiring their immediate attention. She waited 30 seconds and tried again, adding slight emphasis to her voice. Delta 447 Heavy, Jacksonville Center, radio check, how do you read? Again, only silence. Patricia felt the first flutter of concern, the subtle unease that comes when routine procedures suddenly break pattern without explanation. In 20 years of air traffic control, she had handled thousands of aircraft and communicated with tens of thousands of pilots, developing an instinct for when something was genuinely wrong versus when technical issues or human error caused temporary communication lapses. This silence felt wrong, dangerous, completely contrary to the constant chatter that normally filled her headset during busy morning traffic flows. She tried a third time, her professionalism masking growing alarm. Delta 447 Heavy, Jacksonville Center, if you read this transmission, squawk ident and acknowledge. On her radar screen, Flight 447 continued painting its steady return, the aircraft apparently functioning normally with no deviation from assigned altitude or heading. But the complete lack of radio response transformed a routine morning into an emerging crisis requiring immediate escalation through the air traffic control chain of command. Patricia reached for the emergency coordination line, preparing to notify her supervisor and initiate procedures for aircraft communication failure while dozens of possible scenarios raced through her mind, each more alarming than the last. Inside the cabin of Flight 447, 92 passengers remained completely unaware that anything unusual was developing. The seatbelt sign remained off, people moved freely to lavatories, flight attendants continued serving drinks, and the aircraft flew with the same smooth stability it had maintained since takeoff from Denver. Some passengers dozed peacefully, others worked on laptops, and a few chatted quietly with seatmates about destinations and vacation plans that awaited them in South Florida's perpetual sunshine. Elena had drifted into light sleep, her empty coffee cup resting on the closed tray table, her head tilted against the cool window where endless sky stretched beyond the glass. She dreamed vaguely of old flights, of thunderstorm approaches into challenging airports and nights spent in anonymous hotel rooms reading emergency procedure manuals before dawn departures. The dreams carried no sharp edges or traumatic memories, just the familiar background noise of an aviation career that had defined her identity for most of her adult life before trauma shattered everything and drove her away from cockpits forever. In the forward galley, Jessica Chen glanced at her watch and prepared to coordinate lunch service timing with the flight deck. Standard procedure required calling the cockpit to confirm the pilots wanted their crew meals delivered before passenger service began, a routine communication that happened on every flight without exception or variation. She reached for the intercom handset mounted on the galley wall, pressed the call button, and waited for the familiar click of the cockpit acknowledging her call. Nothing happened. No click, no greeting, no response of any kind. Jessica frowned and tried again, assuming perhaps the pilots were busy with air traffic communication or checking weather updates. She held the handset to her ear, listening to empty silence where she should have heard Captain Morrison's voice greeting her with the professional friendliness that had developed over 3 years of flying together on dozens of trips. She replaced the handset and tried the backup intercom system, suddenly feeling unease creep up her spine like ice water. Again, only silence answered. No static, no connection tone, no acknowledgement, just dead air suggesting the intercom system had somehow failed completely or the cockpit was deliberately not responding to her calls. Jessica's 12 years of flight attendant experience immediately flagged this as abnormal, a significant deviation from standard procedures that demanded immediate investigation and explanation. She walked forward to the reinforced cockpit door, knocked firmly with 3 sharp raps that echoed in the quiet forward cabin, and called out clearly enough to be heard through the thick barrier. Captain Morrison. First Officer Peterson. This is Jessica in the forward galley. Can you hear me? No response came from beyond the locked door. She knocked again, much harder this time, feeling her heart rate accelerate as professional concern transformed into genuine fear. In 12 years of flying, through equipment failures and medical emergencies and severe turbulence that injured passengers, Jessica had never experienced complete cockpit silence without explanation or communication of any kind. Even during the most serious emergencies, pilots maintained constant coordination with cabin crews, providing information and instructions that kept everyone working together toward solutions and survival. This silence felt wrong, terrifying, completely contrary to every procedure and protocol drilled into airline crews from their first day of training. Something catastrophic had happened beyond that reinforced door, something that prevented 2 experienced professional pilots from responding to calls, acknowledging knocks, or maintaining the constant communication that defined proper flight deck procedures. Jessica returned to the galley and picked up the intercom handset again, this time addressing her growing fears directly and explicitly. Captain Morrison, First Officer Peterson, this is Jessica Chen in the forward galley. We are unable to establish intercom contact with the flight deck. We have knocked on the door repeatedly without response. Please acknowledge this message immediately via any available communication method if you are receiving this transmission. Silence answered her urgent plea. Absolute, complete, terrifying silence from the locked cockpit where 2 experienced pilots should have been actively flying the aircraft and maintaining constant awareness of everything happening aboard their flight. Jessica felt ice form in her chest, the cold certainty that something catastrophic had occurred beyond the reinforced door separating the flight deck from the passenger cabin where 92 people trusted in the invisible competence of their flight crew. She quickly called the other 2 flight attendants to the forward galley, keeping her voice low and controlled despite the panic beginning to claw at her professional composure. Maria Santos and flight attendant Robert Chin arrived within seconds, both immediately recognizing the tension in Jessica's face and posture that signaled serious trouble developing. I cannot raise the cockpit through any method, Jessica said quietly, her words barely audible above the constant aircraft noise. No intercom response, no acknowledgement of knocking, complete radio silence with air traffic control according to standard procedures. We need to implement emergency protocols for pilot incapacitation immediately. Maria's face went pale. Both pilots, at the same time? We have to assume worst case until we can confirm otherwise, Jessica replied, her training providing structure and procedure even as fear threatened to overwhelm rational thinking. Complete communication loss with normal aircraft flight suggests incapacitation rather than hijacking or technical failure. We need to locate anyone aboard with aviation knowledge or flight deck experience immediately. The 3 flight attendants exchanged glances, their extensive training suddenly becoming horribly relevant as they faced a scenario that most cabin crews never experienced during entire careers spanning decades. A silent cockpit meant possible pilot incapacitation from decompression, toxic fumes, medical emergencies, or contaminated air supply. Whatever the cause, 92 passengers were now flying aboard an aircraft whose pilots had gone completely silent with no explanation, no warning, and no indication of what was happening beyond the locked door that security protocols prevented them from easily breaching. Robert spoke carefully, choosing words that would not create panic if overheard by nearby passengers. "Should we make a cabin announcement asking for pilots or flight crew?" Jessica shook her head. "Not yet. That would create immediate panic and chaos. We quietly search for anyone with relevant experience first, then escalate to announcements if we find nobody. Start in first class and work backward systematically, asking passengers discreetly about aviation backgrounds." The flight attendants dispersed through the cabin, moving with forced casualness that hid their growing terror as they leaned close to passengers and spoke in quiet voices, asking seemingly innocent questions about professions and backgrounds. Most passengers responded with confusion or mild curiosity, sensing something unusual in the flight attendant's demeanor but not yet understanding the magnitude of the crisis developing around them. Maria reached row 14 in economy and leaned down to speak with the woman in the middle seat who appeared to be sleeping. She gently touched Elena's shoulder, the light pressure instantly triggering the awareness that emergency situations demand from people trained to respond to crises. Elena's eyes opened immediately, her body tensing as she registered the flight attendant's pale face and strained expression hovering above her. "Ma'am, I apologize for disturbing you, but I need to ask if you have any flight experience, aviation background, or pilot training of any kind," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite obvious stress. "We're experiencing a communication situation with the flight deck and we're trying to locate anyone aboard with relevant skills or knowledge who might be able to assist us." Elena's mind immediately processed dozens of implications from those carefully chosen words. Communication situation with the flight deck. Not, "the pilots are busy," or, "we're having radio problems," but the specific language and controlled panic in the flight attendant's face told Elena everything she needed to know about the severity of whatever crisis was unfolding in the cockpit 70 feet ahead. "I'm a pilot," Elena said simply, her voice carrying the flat calm of someone who had faced emergencies too serious for emotion or dramatic reaction. 18 years as a commercial airline captain with over 12,000 hours, plus 5 years as a test pilot for aircraft manufacturers. "What exactly is happening right now?" Maria's relief was visible and immediate, her entire body posture changing as she realized she had found exactly what the crew desperately needed. "The cockpit is not responding to any communication attempts of any kind. No intercom acknowledgement, no response to knocking, complete radio silence with air traffic control. We cannot establish contact with either pilot through any available method. We need someone with flight deck knowledge and emergency training right now." Elena was already unbuckling her seatbelt, her emergency training completely overriding the fear and psychological trauma that had kept her away from cockpits for 2 years since the test flight accident that killed her colleagues. 92 people aboard this aircraft needed help immediately, and whatever psychological barriers she had carefully constructed to protect herself from aviation memories suddenly meant absolutely nothing compared to the immediate danger facing everyone around her on this flight. She stood quickly, squeezing past the sleeping businessman and the teenage girl who looked up from her phone with confused expression. "Take me to the flight deck immediately," Elena told Maria. "How long has the cockpit been completely silent?" "About 12 minutes since we first attempted contact," Maria replied as they moved quickly toward the forward galley. "No response to multiple intercom calls, no acknowledgement of repeated knocking, nothing at all." "What about aircraft behavior? Any unusual attitudes, altitude changes, course deviations, anything that would indicate loss of control?" "Everything feels completely normal. Smooth flight, steady altitude as far as I can tell without instruments." Elena nodded, her trained mind already running through the limited number of scenarios that could explain total cockpit silence while the aircraft continued flying normally under autopilot control. Sudden catastrophic decompression would have triggered passenger oxygen masks and obvious altitude changes that everyone would notice. Major electrical failure would likely affect multiple systems beyond just communications and would be accompanied by various warnings and abnormal indications. Cockpit fire would produce smoke detectable throughout the forward cabin within minutes. That left the most probable explanation as some form of pilot incapacitation affecting both crew members simultaneously, possibly from carbon monoxide poisoning, contaminated air supply pressurization failure, or rapid hypoxia from subtle decompression that gradually rendered both pilots unconscious before either could recognize symptoms or don emergency oxygen equipment. Whatever the cause, immediate intervention was required before the autopilot exhausted its programmed instructions and the aircraft began flying unpredictable patterns that could endanger everyone aboard. They reached the forward galley where Jessica and Robert waited with expressions mixing desperate hope and barely controlled terror. Jessica looked at Elena with searching intensity, trying to assess whether this quiet woman in casual clothes could possibly handle the catastrophic emergency unfolding around them. "You're a pilot?" Jessica asked, needing verbal confirmation despite Maria's report. "Yes. 18 years commercial captain, 5 years test pilot, over 12,000 flight hours in aircraft including this exact model," Elena replied, her voice steady and professional. "I need immediate access to the flight deck using emergency protocols. Every second we delay increases risk for everyone aboard." Jessica hesitated only briefly, security protocols and post-September 11 training making her instinctively cautious about breaching the reinforced cockpit door. But the procedures for suspected pilot incapacitation were absolutely clear, and complete communication loss with normal aircraft flight met every criterion for emergency access regardless of potential security concerns. "The emergency access code initiates a 30-second countdown," Jessica explained quickly. "If the pilots are conscious and alert, they can override the entry. If they don't override, we can access the cockpit, which confirms they're unable to respond. Which means either way we get critical information," Elena confirmed. "If they override, we know they're conscious and can demand explanation for the communication failure. If they don't override, we confirm incapacitation and I can take control. Enter the code immediately." Jessica moved to the cockpit door keypad, her hands shaking slightly as she input the emergency access code that she had memorized years ago but never imagined actually using in a real crisis. The panel beeped acknowledgement and a small display began counting down from 30 seconds, the delay designed to give alert pilots sufficient time to assess the entry request and either permit access or activate the override that would keep the door locked against potential threats. The seconds ticked away with agonizing slowness while Elena stood ready just behind Jessica, her body tense with anticipation and her mind preparing for whatever scene waited beyond the reinforced door. If both pilots were unconscious from hypoxia or contaminated air, she would need to assess their conditions rapidly, determine if they could be revived or needed removal from the seats, take control of the aircraft manually, establish immediate communication with air traffic control, declare an emergency, and begin executing diversion procedures toward the nearest suitable airport while simultaneously managing her own psychological trauma about sitting in a cockpit again. 30 seconds expired. The door lock disengaged with a mechanical click that sounded impossibly loud in the tense silence of the forward galley. No override had occurred, definitively confirming that both pilots were either unable or unwilling to prevent emergency access to the flight deck. Elena reached for the door handle, took one deep breath to center herself and suppress the fear trying to claw its way up from her stomach, and pulled the heavy door open with steady force. The scene inside the cockpit hit her with immediate devastating clarity. Captain Morrison slumped unconscious in the left seat, his head lolled forward against his chest, his hands limp and unresponsive in his lap, his breathing shallow and barely perceptible. First Officer Peterson lay collapsed against the right side window, equally unconscious, his right arm hanging uselessly beside the seat, his face pale and waxy under the harsh cockpit lighting. Both men showed no signs of physical trauma, no blood, no obvious injury, no indication of violence or struggle. The aircraft flew itself on autopilot with mechanical precision, maintaining perfect course and altitude despite the incapacitated human crew, its sophisticated systems functioning normally while the pilots responsible for commanding it lay helpless and unaware. The primary flight displays showed all parameters within normal ranges, the engines operated smoothly at cruise power settings, and nothing about the aircraft's condition suggested anything was wrong except for the two unconscious men whose duty was ensuring safe operation. Elena's emergency training took over completely, pushing aside fear and doubt and trauma as she entered the cockpit with rapid decisive movements born from thousands of hours handling crises. She moved immediately to Captain Morrison, checking his carotid pulse with 2 fingers while watching his chest for breathing movements. Pulse was present but weak and thready, breathing shallow and irregular, skin cool and slightly clammy. She performed the same quick assessment on First Officer Peterson, finding similar symptoms suggesting both men had been overcome by something environmental rather than simultaneous medical emergencies. Their symptoms strongly indicated carbon monoxide exposure, contaminated air supply, or hypoxia from gradual decompression that had slowly rendered them unconscious before either recognized the danger or could respond appropriately. Whatever the cause, both pilots required immediate removal from the contaminated cockpit environment and emergency oxygen administration while Elena took control of the aircraft and executed diversion procedures. She slid into the left seat, her body automatically assuming familiar positions despite 2 years away from cockpits, her hands going to the yoke and throttles with muscle memory that came instantly and completely. The Boeing 777 felt simultaneously foreign and intimately familiar, like returning to a childhood home after years away and finding everything exactly where memory insisted it should be. Her eyes scanned the instrument panel and the systematic pattern drilled into her through thousands of hours, checking altitude, airspeed, heading, engine parameters, fuel quantity, and dozens of other critical values that told her everything about the aircraft's current state. Primary flight display showed 37,000 feet altitude, airspeed 288 knots, heading 135 degrees directly toward Miami as programmed. All engines operated within normal parameters, fuel quantity remained adequate for the planned flight plus required reserves, weather radar showed clear conditions ahead. Everything about the aircraft's mechanical condition appeared perfectly normal except for the 2 unconscious pilots and the complete radio silence that had now lasted nearly 20 minutes. Elena reached immediately for the oxygen mask stowed beside the captain's seat, pulling it over her face with practiced motion and feeling the rush of pure oxygen flooding her lungs through the demand regulator. If contaminated air had overcome the pilots, she needed to avoid the same fate while working to save the aircraft and its 92 passengers from whatever disaster loomed ahead. She adjusted the mask strap for proper seal, verified oxygen flow was adequate, then reached for the radio panel with her right hand while her left remained on the yoke. Jacksonville Center, Delta 447 Heavy, emergency declared, pilot incapacitation, flight deck secure under qualified emergency pilot, requesting immediate priority handling and vectors to nearest suitable airport with medical facilities standing by. Her voice came through the oxygen mask slightly muffled but perfectly clear and professional, her tone carrying the controlled urgency that air traffic controllers were extensively trained to recognize and respond to immediately without hesitation or delay. The relief in Patricia Williams's response was audible even through the radio static and compression. Delta 447 Heavy, Jacksonville Center, roger your emergency, we copy pilot incapacitation and flight deck secure, confirm aircraft is under positive control at this time. Affirmative Jacksonville, aircraft stable at flight level 370, autopilot engaged, both original crew members unconscious from suspected environmental contamination. I am a qualified airline transport pilot and former commercial captain acting as emergency pilot in command, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport with medical facilities, rescue equipment, and long runway for overweight landing. The controller's response came quickly, her 20 years of experience allowing her to process the unprecedented situation rapidly and provide exactly the support Elena needed. Delta 447 Heavy, nearest suitable airport is Jacksonville International, runway 31, 11,000 feet available, distance 68 nautical miles at your 12 o'clock position, descend and maintain flight level 240, turn left heading 085, medical and emergency equipment will be standing by on your arrival, expect vectors for ILS approach. Elena acknowledged the instructions with professional brevity and immediately began the descent, her hands moving across the controls with practiced efficiency despite emotional turmoil threatening to break through the professional calm she maintained through sheer willpower. She adjusted the autopilot to capture the new altitude, retarded throttles to begin descent while extending speed brakes slightly to increase rate, and turned the heading bug to 085 degrees, watching the aircraft respond smoothly to her commands. Behind her, Jessica stood frozen in the cockpit doorway, watching in amazement as the quiet woman from seat 14C transformed into a confident pilot executing emergency procedures with the competence of someone who had done exactly this hundreds of times in simulators and real flights throughout a distinguished career. Elena's hands moved constantly across switches and controls, her eyes scanning instruments in systematic patterns, her voice crisp and professional as she coordinated with air traffic control. "We need to remove both pilots from the flight deck immediately and get them on supplemental oxygen," Elena said without turning around, her focus remaining entirely on flying the aircraft. "Whatever incapacitated them, we must assume contaminated air in this cockpit. Get them into the cabin, administer portable oxygen from emergency equipment, keep them warm with blankets, and monitor their breathing. If they start regaining consciousness, prevent them from trying to stand or move suddenly until paramedics can evaluate them properly." Jessica immediately coordinated with Maria and Robert, and within minutes several strong male passengers had been quietly recruited to help carefully extract both unconscious pilots from their seats and carry them into the first-class cabin. The pilots were laid gently on the floor between seat rows and covered with blankets while flight attendants administered oxygen from portable bottles, monitoring their breathing and checking pulses every few minutes while Elena flew the aircraft toward Jacksonville with steady hands and racing mind. She now sat completely alone in the left seat, her right hand resting on the throttles, her left hand gripping the yoke lightly despite the autopilot handling actual control inputs. She scanned instruments constantly in the systematic pattern that exceptional pilots never abandon even when automation handles immediate tasks, her training demanding continuous awareness of every system and parameter even during emergency situations that would overwhelm less experienced aviators. The Boeing 777 descended smoothly through scattered clouds, responding to her commands with the precision that made modern jets extraordinarily capable machines when guided by skilled hands backed by years of training and experience. Elena coordinated with Jacksonville Air Traffic Control, receiving vectors that positioned her aircraft on a long final approach to runway 31 while controllers cleared other traffic from her path and established a sterile environment around the emergency aircraft. In the cabin behind her, the atmosphere had transformed completely from casual routine to controlled tension as passengers now fully understood something serious had happened despite flight attendants' best efforts to maintain calm. Most passengers remained remarkably composed once crew members explained that a qualified pilot was controlling the aircraft and they were diverting to Jacksonville as a precautionary measure. Some passengers cried quietly, others held hands with strangers, a few continued reading magazines with determined normalcy, and the college students heading to Miami sat pale and silent with their earlier excitement completely forgotten. Elena continued the descent, extending speed brakes further to increase descent rate while adjusting power to maintain appropriate approach speed. She armed the approach mode on the autopilot, watching it capture the instrument landing system signals that would guide her to the runway with precision accuracy. At appropriate altitudes and speeds, she lowered landing gear and heard the reassuring thunk of the wheels locking into position, then extended flaps incrementally as the aircraft slowed for final approach configuration. The Jacksonville runway appeared ahead through the windscreen, a long black strip bordered by approach lights creating a visual path through hazy morning air. Elena disconnected the autopilot at 500 feet and took manual control, feeling the aircraft respond immediately to her inputs with the sensitivity that made hand-flying these jets both challenging and deeply satisfying for pilots who preferred physical connection with their machines. She adjusted power slightly to correct for sink rate, added a touch of right rudder to compensate for mild crosswind, and began the final descent toward the runway threshold while emergency vehicles followed her progress from strategic positions around the airport perimeter. Her landing was smooth and professional despite 2 years away from cockpits, the main wheels touching down exactly on the 1,000-foot touchdown zone markers with barely perceptible impact, the nose gear settling gently as she deployed thrust reversers and applied brakes with steady progressive pressure. The aircraft decelerated steadily, and Elena guided it off the runway onto a taxiway where emergency vehicles waited with lights flashing and paramedics ready to board. She brought the massive jet to a complete stop, set the parking brake, and began shutdown procedures while her hands trembled slightly and her mind processed everything that had happened in the 38 minutes since Maria Santos woke her from sleep in seat 14C. She secured both engines, watching instruments wind down as fuel flow stopped and turbines decelerated from thousands of RPM to complete stillness. Around her, the cockpit fell silent except for the diminishing whine of spooling engines and the crackling radio communications between emergency coordinators on the ground organizing the response to this unprecedented emergency. Jessica appeared in the cockpit doorway again, her face showing exhaustion and profound relief mixed with admiration. "Both pilots are regaining consciousness slowly," she reported. "Paramedics are boarding now to provide advanced medical care. Air traffic control wants to talk with you, and the airline operations center has been calling every 30 seconds demanding to know what happened. Everyone wants to know who you are and where you came from." Elena pulled off the oxygen mask and set it carefully aside, her hands now trembling noticeably as adrenaline drained from her system and the magnitude of what she had just accomplished began penetrating the professional calm she had maintained throughout the emergency. "I'm just a passenger who happened to have the right training at the right moment," she said quietly, her voice rough with suppressed emotion. Behind her in the cabin, passengers began applauding spontaneously, the sound building from scattered claps into sustained appreciation that filled the entire aircraft with waves of gratitude and relief. People stood in the aisles clapping and cheering, some crying openly, others shouting thanks toward the cockpit where Elena sat trying to process overwhelming emotions threatening to break through the professional detachment that had carried her through the crisis. Elena closed her eyes against unexpected tears, overwhelmed by the realization that she had just done what she thought she would never do again after the test flight accident that killed her colleagues and drove her from aviation. She had returned to a cockpit, taken command of an aircraft in crisis, and saved 92 passengers plus 2 pilots through skills and training that she had tried desperately to leave behind when trauma made flying impossible to continue. As paramedics rushed aboard to treat Captain Morrison and First Officer Peterson, as emergency coordinators began investigations that would eventually determine a faulty environmental control system had leaked carbon monoxide into the cockpit, and as airline executives scrambled to understand how a passenger had landed one of their aircraft, Elena sat quietly in the captain's seat and allowed herself to remember why she had loved flying before fear and grief drove her away. Not for the routine or the destinations or the technical challenges that defined commercial aviation, but for moments exactly like this when skill and courage and years of training came together to save lives that would otherwise have been lost to mechanical failure and unfortunate circumstance. She had saved 92 passengers today, brought them safely to ground when their flight crew could not, and proven to herself that the pilot she had been before the accident still existed somewhere beneath the grief and trauma that had silenced her for 2 long years. Hours later, after giving detailed statements to FAA investigators and accident response teams, after accepting quiet thanks from conscious crew members and emotional passengers, and after declining a dozen interview requests from news organizations who had already begun reporting the story of the passenger pilot who saved Flight 447. Elena stood alone in the Jacksonville terminal watching aircraft take off and land in the endless cycle that defines modern aviation. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from airline executives requesting her contact information, from news organizations wanting exclusive interviews, from Captain Morrison and First Officer Peterson thanking her for actions that had saved not just their lives but the lives of 92 passengers who had trusted them with safe passage through dangerous skies. She ignored most of the messages, feeling exhausted and emotionally drained and uncertain what any of this meant for the careful life she had built away from cockpits. She looked out the terminal windows at a massive Boeing 777 identical to the one she had just landed, watching it rotate off the runway and climb into blue sky with landing gear retracting and flaps coming up as it accelerated toward cruising altitude and some distant destination. For 2 years she had avoided airports, avoided thinking about flying, avoided all the memories and trauma that had driven her away from the career that had defined her entire adult existence. But something had changed today, some barrier had cracked, and Elena found herself wanting to fly again, wanting to return to the cockpit where she belonged despite the accident that had convinced her she could never face aviation again. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Rebecca Martinez, the airline's chief pilot and an old friend from flight instructor days when both were young pilots building hours toward careers they could barely imagine. She pressed call and waited through 2 rings before Rebecca answered with immediate urgency. "Elena. I've been trying to reach you for 3 hours. I've been following what happened on Flight 447 and I cannot believe you just hand flew a 7-7 to an emergency landing after 2 years out of the cockpit. You saved 92 lives today doing something maybe 5 other people on that aircraft could have accomplished successfully. Rebecca, I need to talk with you about something important, Elena said quietly, watching another jet climb away from Earth outside the terminal windows. I think I'm ready to come back to flying. Not immediately, not tomorrow, but soon. I thought I was done forever after the test flight accident, but today showed me that I never really stopped being a pilot. I just got scared and ran away from the thing I was meant to do with my life. Rebecca's response came quickly, her voice mixing professional assessment with personal warmth. Elena, you were always one of the best pilots I ever flew with, and nothing that happened in that test flight was your fault regardless of what your grief told you. If you're ready to come back, we would be honored to have you flying with us again. But you need to be absolutely certain, because coming back from extended absence requires significant recurrent training and psychological evaluation to ensure you're truly ready for the responsibility. I understand, Elena replied, still watching aircraft operations outside. I'm not completely certain about anything right now except that sitting in that cockpit today felt like coming home after a long journey through places I didn't belong. Give me a few weeks to think about everything and make a real decision instead of an emotional reaction to one dramatic day. They talked for 20 more minutes about training requirements and psychological evaluations and the process for returning to airline flying after extended absence. When Elena finally ended the call, she felt simultaneously exhausted and energized, drained by the day's events but also excited about possibilities she had considered permanently lost after the accident destroyed her confidence and drove her from aviation. 3 months later, Elena Reyes returned to airline flying after completing extensive recurrent training that tested every aspect of her knowledge and skills. She spent weeks in ground school reviewing procedures and regulations, hours in simulators executing normal operations and emergency scenarios, and days flying with Czech pilots who evaluated her performance with the rigor demanded by commercial aviation safety standards. She passed every Czech ride and evaluation with the competence of someone who had never really stopped being a pilot, just temporarily forgotten why she became one initially. On her first revenue flight back as captain, carrying passengers from Denver to Los Angeles on a clear summer morning remarkably similar to the day 3 months earlier when she saved Flight 447, Elena sat in the left seat during cruise and looked out at endless sky stretching to every horizon. Her first officer, a young pilot named Marcus Chin completing his first trip with a new captain, noticed her expression and smiled with the casual curiosity of someone who didn't know her history. Captain Reyes, the crew schedulers told me this is your first trip back after some time away, Marcus said carefully. How does it feel to be flying again? Elena adjusted the throttles slightly, making a minor power adjustment that the autopilot could have handled but that she preferred to do manually, maintaining the physical connection between pilot and machine that defines the best aviators. Feels like I never left, she said simply, not mentioning the silent cockpit or the emergency landing or the 2 unconscious pilots she had saved along with 92 passengers who never knew how close they came to disaster that morning over the southern United States. And as Flight 1847 continued toward California with Elena Reyes firmly in command, she understood completely that the story of Flight 447 and the silent cockpit hadn't ended her aviation career as she had feared during those terrible first hours after the emergency landing. Instead, it had saved her career by forcing her back into the cockpit she was meant to occupy, reminding her that some people are born to fly aircraft and guide passengers safely through whatever challenges the sky presents regardless of fear or trauma or grief. The passengers behind her had no idea who was flying them that morning, no knowledge of the woman whose emergency actions 3 months earlier had made international news before she deliberately retreated back into the anonymity she preferred. They ate their snacks, watched their movies, and trusted completely in the invisible competence of their flight crew, never knowing that their captain had once saved 92 lives when every other option had failed and only extraordinary skill stood between catastrophic disaster and survival. And Elena preferred it exactly that way, doing the job she loved without recognition or attention, simply being the pilot her passengers needed whether they faced routine flights or catastrophic emergencies that tested the absolute limits of human capability and professional training. Because that's what the best pilots do, they show up, they fly the aircraft with consummate skill, they bring their passengers safely home, and they do it again the next day without expecting applause or acknowledgement beyond the quiet satisfaction of difficult work done exceptionally well. As the California coast appeared ahead and Elena began the descent toward Los Angeles, her hands moved across the controls with practiced ease earned through thousands of hours and millions of miles, her mind already preparing for the approach and landing that would complete another routine flight in a career that was, for Elena Reyes at least, anything but ordinary or simple or easily explained to people who had never sat in the captain's seat when everything went catastrophically wrong and survival depended entirely on years of training suddenly becoming desperately relevant. She smiled slightly behind her oxygen mask, feeling the aircraft respond to her gentle inputs, and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, and that no amount of fear or trauma or grief could ever truly separate her from the sky that would always be her home.